I thought I would start with a quote from a local author, which is why I brought my phone here. This is Ursula Le Guin from her acceptance speech for the National Book Award back in 2014. I think hard times are coming when we will be wanting the voices of writers who can see alternatives to how we live now. They can see through our fear-stricken society and its obsessive technologies to other ways of being. And even imagine some real grounds for hope. We will need writers who can remember freedom, poets, visionaries, the realists of a larger reality. Right now, I think we need writers who know the difference between production of a market commodity and the practice of an art. The profit motive is often in conflict with the aims of art. We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine rights of kings. Power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Resistance and change often begin in art, and very often in our art, the art of words. That's a little bit from a local author, I think, Ursula Le Guin, who's one of the most prominent voices of science fiction. How should we start our conversation about sustainability?
Yes. Do you want to start with the intersection of sustainability, or the intersection of AI and science fiction?
AI and science fiction. I thought we should maybe.
Or start with about sustainability and science fiction first.
Right. So, what I do at Utopia is a festival I run in Tel Aviv. We collaborate a lot with Republica. Utopia is a science fiction festival and a festival for ideas and future storytelling. And we present films, do discussions, talks, and we've started doing these series of workshops that bring together what we call future practitioners, people who in their everyday lives or in their profession need to think about the future, imagine, design, and create the future, which means activists, policymakers, designers, and so forth. And we bring them together to do workshops and share methodologies. And science fiction has had, I think, is lacking in imagination when it comes to sustainability. It's one of the fields that it is lacking in. It has not done a good job at imagining close futures that deal with climate change. Either we see post-apocalyptic wastelands or dystopic, ultra-capitalistic cities of the future, but we don't have a set of metaphors for what's coming. Like ready-made metaphors like the cities of Blade Runner or Fifth Element, or just the ready-made Frankenstein. So that's kind of a place where science fiction is actually lacking, and one thing we would want to see changed. If there's one thing I can point at is some of Ursula Le Guin's work, actually, but also science fiction isn't just narrative, it's also design and aesthetic. And there is an aesthetic movement, mostly aesthetic movement, called solar punk, I think. But not that kind of showcases what might have been in terms of our technological relationship with nature, and how societies and urban structures, both figurative and actual structures, could have been made not in contention with nature, but as part of nature. But so I can talk on and on about science fiction and sustainability and other things. But I wanted to ask you, because from what we've discussed earlier, your work with Almudena.
Yes.
Yes, got the name right. So you're a software engineer or a data scientist?
Yes, I guess there are many terms out there now, but let's say machine learning engineer and a data scientist. I'll use those two terms.
We don't want AI in the conversation.
I guess we could, yes. I guess AI, well, that's a side topic, as AI seems to be the more known term, but yes, it could be considered an AI solution.
So your professional background is in machine learning, which is the actual term used for like the term used in media or in general circles is AI. I think there are two major fears that are very much present in the media, and they might actually be realistic fears of the future. One is climate change, and the other is artificial intelligence.
Right.
Where do you see these intersect, if at all?
As far as, say, AI and climate change intersecting, I tend to have the more positive perspective that AI can help with the climate change problem. But, like we talked about earlier, as far as AI impacting the climate change problem, I think what I see has to do with our behaviors. How is AI affecting our behaviors that we're not, say, coexisting with nature? Which could be, I've thought about the hardware.
Hardware?
Yes, so say say technological waste, the physical product, sitting around. And then as far as our own lifestyles, that we're not maybe as aware or as interactive with nature and wanting to preserve it because our behaviors have changed over time due to our use of AI or possibly development of it.
So tell us, well, Almudena was Almudena.
Yes.
With reference to by the moderator and by myself, tell us a little bit about what Almudena is.
So Almudena started not too long ago, about end of last year. Their goal was they wanted to help solve social good issues by using AI solutions. And they would get these projects from nonprofits or other organizations, and they would put out a request for volunteers to volunteer their time to work on the project for 2 months.
Volunteers would be mostly coders or data scientists or?
It has ended up being a mix. It could be coders, it could be people that are already in the industry working as data science, machine learning engineers. It could be students. It's a broad range of ages. The youngest guy was 16 years old. The oldest, I believe, is in the 70s. It happened to span geographical locations. Some people might have a college degree, some might not. Some might be just in the beginning stages of their
But this is
career.
international.
Yes, and it has spread. And since we all work virtually, you just need a laptop and internet connection, you can participate.
And what sort of projects does Almudena kind of tackle?
So some of them have had to do with sustainability. So for example, the one that's coming up now, there is a NGO in Brazil that wants help using satellite images to help identify the damage by the fires.
Yeah, you told me about that one.
So that would involve machine learning, computer vision, which is, so for example, I think deep learning is in the media that does very well with images, and so this is a typical project that they would get and then have volunteers to work on it.
So you told me a little bit about the volunteer situation there. And can you expand about the resources and?
So the interesting situation with Almudena is that there are a surplus of volunteers. So I believe about 200 people applied for this particular challenge. 100 of them have all the qualifications to participate, but they can only really accommodate 30 to 40 people on a challenge, because then more than that, it's hard to be able to contribute to the work. And so they're actually in a situation where they need more projects, or if organizations out there need help with either data, it could be machine learning, artificial intelligence, whatever, there are a lot of volunteers that are eager to work on those projects.
So if there's a good cause out there,
yes,
sustainability or otherwise,
right,
Almudena may have some of the resources required to tackle that if it's solvable by software.
Right. If the scope, it could be solved with that. There is currently, the projects have a 2-month time duration, but the 30 to 40 people help because there's more people being able to volunteer, and the strategy is that you can work on tasks in what's the word? You don't have to work on things in sequence. You can work on tasks in parallel, and everyone works together to help each other out to get things done faster in the shorter duration of time.
Can you share about some of the projects you've worked on for Almudena?
Sure. So my first project with them actually had to do with a man who was in the field, and he worked for, I believe, World Vision, and he wanted to tackle the problem of post-traumatic stress disorder, especially, say, those who are refugees, or they're in situations where it would be hard for them to be assessed or determine that they have these symptoms. So that challenge was actually particularly difficult because we had no data to work with. We had to figure out what data we could get and how we could come up with some kind of a solution that could be a start to help. So we ended up, one of the volunteers knew some people that had chat transcripts between a therapist and someone that was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. So by getting that data, and people in the domain who have expertise, that they could label what symptoms someone had of post-traumatic stress disorder in this conversation, and then using that data to train a machine learning model to help that if somebody else was using a chat program and they get asked a series of questions, that it could help them determine that they could have post-traumatic stress disorder and to go seek resources. And so a case example would be if you have refugees that are in a camp, they might confuse the stress of their situation with not being post-traumatic stress disorder, and others around them might think they don't have a problem. And so and people can't go reach everybody out in the field, so having an application that can do that would be helpful.
That's remarkable. I think I need to go, okay. And you're going to stay here and jazz on with another speaker.
All right, so we will see you at the end, or not me, but yes. Hello. Oh, thank you very much. So we can sustain ourselves.
I know.
Yes.
Oh, that light is bright. Can you all hear me okay? Should I be using, all right, I'll use this.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, what's strange about it is we can't see any of your faces, so
Kind of.
that's
hard,
a
yeah.
strange situation going on up here. Well, this is fun. I'm Modas, Zepeda. They mentioned that we should introduce ourselves and give some context. And so what a joy it is to speak with you. As they mentioned, I'm the CEO of a company and also work on bringing more companies that have profit and purpose. And I was just so struck by what you had to say. It sounds like a lot of what you're doing is recognizing that there's this need for context for data.
Yes.
And so I came word came to mind. This author, Rebecca Solnit, in her book Men Explain Things to Me, talks about this notion of the tyranny of the quantifiable and how there's so much that's lost when we rely on data, on kind of big data and the quantitative. And it sounds like a lot of what your work is doing is putting the qualitative into a quantitative context. Am I reading that correctly, that you're trying to tell a deeper story? So can you talk a little bit about what your experience has been like being a woman in this field, if that had any impact on your perspective of how we collect quantitative and qualitative data, and what you saw as the dominant paradigm of storytelling and what you're out to change?
So for me, as far as, unfortunately, AI is concerned and these tech fields, they are not representative of the general population. So I am considered a minority, let's say, and because it's such a new field, if you look at gender, I believe it's around 20% or so are female and the rest are male. So it's still very skewed. And let's see, for the other part of your question, you were asking about
Does it have a perspective? Does data have a perspective that it's pushing towards a certain lens of interpretation? And what different lens do you feel like you are bringing to the field?
Got it, yes. So I think by not being part of the majority, that I will have my own perspective and experiences that others will not have, and maybe I could have domain knowledge, depending on what the problem is. And then say with the organization I'm working with, because it happens to be that there are people all over the world working on a problem that increases the diversity, but another advantage to that is that if, say, like for example, the project in Brazil, people from Brazil are actually going to be part of the project. And so it's not just people trying to solve a problem for other people, but people who understand the problem and experience themselves are going to be part of the solution.
So a lot of my work is overlapping in this way, where you're trying to bring the people that are impacted into a participatory process. And very often what I find is that the systems themselves are skewed to say that takes too long, it's too labor intensive, we couldn't possibly involve them, it couldn't possibly be non-extractive. And a lot of my frustration and my own personal lived experience is that people believe that that deep listening that's co-creative and non-extractive is too hard and just too squishy. And a lot of what I've had to experience is how to articulate and put words to how valuable that intermediate step is in establishing trust, being in relationship, actually doing community work. And I'm curious what your experience has been like having to justify the certain angle of inquiry that you have in these experiences.
That's definitely a big thing that I've experienced, is that I don't know if it's because of technology, but this idea of we want more and we want it fast and just get it to work. But the contradiction is that ends up being a waste of time, because if no one is going to use it, no one's going to trust it, it's not going to be helpful, then what's the point? That it's better to, to give the argument that it's better to spend more time and to consider what you're doing. It might, appear to people this is slow, but it's important, and you're actually making better use of your time by creating something that's going to actually be useful.
And what are people saying in response to that? I mean, it seems so obvious, hopefully, to all of us in this room and to us in our work. But how have you encountered and talked through that resistance that people might have to do it this other way?
Sometimes some will understand it and they'll get it, but unfortunately, sometimes they have to go through the experience of failure, and then they realize, oh, maybe we shouldn't have done that, and then. When they realize that's the contrary, then they might slowly change their ways.
So they have to exhaust themselves in the old process.
Right.
Another thing that I was thinking about, and I think it would just be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about your career as an athlete, if you're okay with
Yes.
that, is very often I've been having conversations with friends and I where we are saying the focus is on the organs, but there's not a lot of focus on the connective tissue. So a lot of the work that I see you doing and the work that I'm doing is what is the connective tissue to actually make a holistic context, to make sense of this in a more holistic fashion. And even our Western medicine is so focused on like the organs as being this thing. And then there's so much else going on from a nerve and circulation and tissue and musculature standpoint. I'm curious, like, how has your career as an athlete, and if you're open to talking a little bit about your background, how do you translate the physical practice that you've experienced into the data and AI work that you're doing?
So just thinking as you were talking, that the idea, it's interesting with the idea of modern medicine and the organs, because, and what you talked about of taking time on a project, that others might see why are you approaching it this way, that if you actually do take a holistic way of taking care of yourself, such as exercising and whatnot, and using less of modern medicine, that is actually a slow way, but it's better in the long run versus trying to take target symptoms to get them, relieved quickly. And as far as the data piece, I think some stereotypes that are out there is that athletes are dumb, but it's actually not true because it's very scientific. And if you actually want to make the best use of your time, you collect the data on how you do in whatever workout you're doing, how you're feeling. So there's a quantitative piece, a qualitative, how you do, how is your day. And then you also plan it short-term and long-term in cycles. And so that also is an important piece. And so I can see it in that, in my work, and just the idea of collecting data in general and thoroughly planning and organizing.
I think that's something that's so core to sustainability that I've been thinking about is you have to operate at different time horizons. And there's the short-term wins, and then there's what is the long-term that I'm gearing toward, that I'm gunning towards here. And a lot of the work seems to be derailed by short-term wins, and there's not the like, even when we think about sustainability from a natural perspective, it's so interesting having this background, like this is what late stage capitalism kind of looks like, folks, is it's just, you're like looking at Karl Lagerfeld while, it's
the protest outside.
What's even happening anymore? It's such a trip, Like we're both up here, I think, trying to be like, essentially like death, winter, it happens, it's painful. How are we coping? Like things are dying, just like there's this collapse. We're in this bubble of a total, utter collapse, and you're trying to talk about it from a meta standpoint as though you can take yourself seriously by holding a microphone while you have protests outside. And you're just like,
interesting, yes.
Like you can't even, if you're not even tuned into the vibration of that, you're not even being truthful to what the hell is going on in this moment right now. So, all right.
It's very interesting, yes.
Tangent. Yeah. But this notion of death and like cycles, and how you have to go through recovery periods with your body as an athlete, and we're going through just this massive death of civilization, and all of us just want to be like, oh, if I just recycle, if I just do this one, this kind of short-term win application of what I perceive to be sustainable without looking at the long arc of history. So I don't know, like, what are your thoughts on time?
As far as time, I think, I guess a disadvantage of technology, it seems that it's reduced our attention spans. People want or seem to want gratification very quickly and soon, but they don't look. It's like there's patience is lost, let's say. People don't want to spend a long time on something. Like you mentioned about the recycling, that if someone feels, if I just recycle this, I've just done so much. Well, you've done a little bit, but you have to be consistent with what you're doing. And I think being consistent and thinking about not just the short-term current, but long-term in the future. People forget about that.
Where did you learn that? Where did you pick that up?
The
notion of consistency.
Oh, yes. So I guess my life, I think, with, let's say, academic, so I had interests, and because of that, I wanted to always improve, and so I would always, and today, try to consistently keep working and learning. And then I see that with the athletics, is that I know that if I stop and I don't do it consistently, it's not the same, that I get more benefits out of it if I do it long term, and then I can reflect and see how it was a good use of time.
And was it like modeled for you, or was it, so for me, the consistency lesson has been something that I've had to struggle with in my life, because both of my parents were artists, and what was modeled to me was this kind of bohemian, let the muse take you where you want.
Okay.
And actually, there was a pretty significant spiritual practice that was buttressing it that I wasn't picking up on as a child, and that they didn't teach me intentionally because they wanted me to find my own practice of consistency.
Yep.
So I had discovered it later in life. But did you have someone model that in your own life, or was there a book, or was it just instilled in your house, or were you actually was that not the culture?
I think it was a mix of both, now that I'm thinking about it. As far as my family, so I'm a second, is that right? First generation, second generation. So my parents came from Pakistan, so I did have some of what you could call the immigrant experience. And I think what's in common is this idea of consistently working hard. And sometimes that's not good because you need to take a break. And so I think that has had an effect of me wanting to take advantage of time and of resources that I have, and just this, desire to keep doing something. But I also later learned I have to also chill out, and take a break, because that's also important for recovery and re-energizing. But I actually did stop, not necessarily planning, but just kind of thinking, okay, what I know in the present, I'm gonna do the best I can with it. I can try to plan for the future, but I need to adapt, because I never know what's gonna happen, to try to have that balance.
Yeah, that's just something that I've experienced a lot lately is people will say, but what's your strategic plan? Or what's your strategy?
Right.
And I'm like, I don't even, I didn't have a strategy for this today to know that we were gonna,
Right.
And my mom, she has a lot of really profound lessons that I've come to appreciate more later on. And what she has to say about this is all you need to do is be prepared to receive the lesson, not necessarily to react. So if you're picking up on what you should be learning in that moment, that's what the work is, instead of this over preparation and thinking that you can control.
And try to plan, yeah, because you can plan, but if you spend so much time, if something doesn't go according to plan, you're not, depending on how someone reacts to that and your experiences, it can be challenging.
And it makes people really mad.
Yes.
Are we out? Oh, sorry.
Okay, yes.
Sorry. I can't see anything.
Oh, yeah, and I'm I think I see a white card. Yes, yeah.
Flagging us down.
Yes. Okay. Well,
It was
it's
a
great
pleasure
talking to
speaking
you.
with you.
Yes.
Yeah.
I will do I take this?
Yeah, if you'd like, yeah. Oh, all right. I'm taking it.
Thank you. Oh my gosh, Hi.
Hello.
Hello. It's great to meet you. I didn't get to talk to you beforehand.
I know,
but-
this is our first date, so we're just gonna go for it.
Yeah, quick introduction for myself and everybody else too. So I'm Kristina. I co-founded and co-direct a nonprofit in the Bay Area called Spectra. It's for women and non-binary people who really want to get to learn more about tech, or maybe they just started out in their tech field, maybe they're 18-year-olds and they just don't know if they want to continue computer science or they want to major in computer science, or even mothers who want to get back into the workforce and want to join tech as well. So a really broad range of people, but that's what I do on the side.
Awesome. Well, So I'd love to talk about when side projects take over your life and actually become the work that you think you want to do. Have you experienced that?
Yeah, so currently Spectra is just a thing I do on the side, really. It started out when I was in college and just continues for the last like 3 years or so. And so it pretty much becomes my full-time job in a way, even though I'm looking for a job right now, for like full-time as well. But I enjoy it so much, just trying to, it's like a passion of mine to be able to build out experiences for people and really see everybody, or as many people as possible, to really just enjoy the experience that they're having, like for example, with the event.
What's the type of transformation that you see?
Sorry, can you elaborate?
What's the type of transportation, like when you're doing events or when you're bringing people into the fold, you said that may not have traditionally been included in tech.
Right.
Like, I can imagine that they are coming in with a certain amount of skepticism or trepidation or self-doubt or a lack of confidence. Like, what are you trying to architect to bring them from that place where they might not have been included traditionally in those spaces to building, it sounds like what your work is doing is building a bridge to a place where they do feel like they can see themselves more. Like, what is that, what type of transformation do you see in the process?
Right. During the event, I really love talking about failure and being able to explain that we all came somewhere and we started at the way bottom, and this is where we are currently. So that's not the whole story when you just see what you are currently. Like, for example, engineers, they struggled as well. They failed, and they failed over and over again, sometimes like many years of it. And that's nothing, you don't really see it currently, but I want to always tell those people that are starting out in the industry or starting out in college that, hey, everybody started out in that position. And just opening it up to making a no judgment zone almost. Creating that conversation, because I feel like a lot of times when you go to professional events or conferences, everybody puts up a front almost, and it's like, oh, I'm the CEO of whatever company, or I do data science or machine learning and stuff, and all those words sound really amazing and everything, but at the same time, they didn't just get into that position. They worked for it, and we want to show them how you can work to become into that role, for example. What about you, though? What do you notice?
What type of transformation do I see?
Right.
I think I think there's this false belief that people are trying, we're trying to be people can see themselves as this. And more what I'm seeing is that people are bringing their own unique answer. So what I'm more interested in is what are you bringing, and not we're trying to shoehorn you into this existent model. Mm-hmm. The way that engineers from different backgrounds solve problems is just different. And it's so rich to have a biodiversity of lived experience informing the way that we design products. And so my interest, I think right now tech is in a weird space where it's trying to kind of diversity wash and be we just need more women and people of color. We're going to shoehorn them into this totally broken system. And what I find a lot more energizing is when those communities are leading the conversation, and we're able to learn from their lived experience and their perspective of what types of problems they want to solve, how they go about solving it, and how those are fundamentally different design impulses, each one unique in their own way. And so I hope that we'll come to a place where we have more curiosity, because I think a diversity of lived experience will actually make the tech sector more sustainable.
Mm-hmm. So how do you you're the CEO of Switchboard currently, right? How do you currently foster that kind of conversation, learning pattern then?
I think a lot of it comes from ambiguity. So if you create spaces to actually listen to where people are at, and then meet them where they're at. But kind of to the previous conversation, that freaks a lot of people out, because they're wait, an open container where you just get to talk and someone is in relationship. And I was a former radio reporter, so my background is in this type of format situation, but more, and people don't actually know how to architect conversations and hold space for one another. And deep listening and being in relationship is this thing that if I said to everyone in this room, turn to your person, turn to the person next to you and engage in conversation the way that we are, each one of you would be doing it in a completely different way based on your own lived experience, and most importantly, how well and how differently other people listen to you in your own life. So if you were never heard, or if sometimes I'll be in a room and I'll ask people to go around and say, what's the earliest memory of someone actually hearing you and actually listening to you as a person? And I'm consistently astonished at how some people will say it was deep into their 20s.
Wow.
That they felt like they were truly heard. Yeah, so I don't know. And I think I had the luxury and gift of that being a really central part of me growing up. And so it was a huge experience that I took for granted.
Mm-hmm. So what are some memorable moments that when you ask that kind of question? Do you have a story you could share with all of us?
Where I felt really heard?
Yeah.
I remember writing a lot. My parents were artists, and I remember that I would write, and they would have kind of these, not salons, but these evenings where there were sculptors and drummers and painters and authors. And I would be invited when I was really young to share my writing, and they were giving me feedback. I mean, not just oh my God, she's so, it wasn't it was we are taking you seriously as a person that is contributing to this conversation. And that just had a huge impact on me. Mm-hmm. How about you? Do you have memories of adults really honing in on what your gifts and talents were in spaces and actually starting to pay attention?
None really come to mind currently, except maybe my professors in college. When I really struggled in college, I had one professor in particular that in office hours, she would ask me follow-up questions to make sure I understood what was happening or what I actually understood. And I felt that was really important because a lot of professors, I went to a school that had 500 kids in one lecture hall basically. So it's you're not really heard in those situations until you talk to the professor one-on-one. And that was the only one that really felt like it was a humanized conversation versus just hey, we're gonna talk in front of everybody and this is the lecture for today, all right, bye, kind of thing. And even in office hours, it's very personable, kind of like this conversation here as well. So I feel that was a time, and she helped me out to figure out where I wanted to go after college as well.
I think this is I know we're supposed to be up here talking about the word sustainability,
yeah.
But I do think this is actually one reason why our systems are not sustainable is because we are relying on the wrong data. If you don't have a sense of warmth and trust and in relationship, then everything you build is just going to be, there's not even a foundation to the house. And so whether it's the product or the process or the software or the system itself, if it's not resting on a solid foundation of mutual love and respect and trust and participation, that whole thing is sitting on top of an unsustainable foundation.
Right.
So a lot of times when people talk about sustainability, to me, it's much more of a process and a perspective. But do you see that with UX work, and just given what you've done in design? Did you question some of the kind of to what we were talking about earlier, foundational principles that UX is based on, that you started to question whether they were the right approach?
Yeah, definitely. I think also, I totally agree with you. So conversation and experience is the foundation almost to build up that whatever you want, or sustainability even. Without that, if you just threw some idea to somebody, it's not they're going to be invited to actually believe it or do anything to go toward that mission. So going back to your question, definitely I ask the why questions a whole bunch of times to try to figure out why they think that way, because everybody has a different perspective, and definitely do question it. Yeah. Sorry, repeat your...
Just what's the dominant approach in UX? What did you see where you were this doesn't actually make any sense because you're doing it in this way that I would do it differently? Did you question any assumptions of how UX as a field currently exists?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think that's why there's user research in every field, and people try to figure out what breaks the barriers of what's currently out there, and what kind of research can I contribute as well further on. Yeah, I think it's really important. Yeah.
Well, one thing I saw it in the Stanford's D School around
Yeah.
design thinking that comes up a lot when we work with clients. Is they're trying to, innovate and create these new systems, and in design thinking, empathy is the first step.
Yes.
As you know, and then they will think that they have completed empathy. So they'll be like, oh, I'm done with the empathy step. And the way that the D School has used this methodology that's now pretty ubiquitous in tech and in many other systems design is the notion that empathy is a thing that you start and you stop. And then you'll find that empathy needs to actually buttress the entire design process, but they stop engaging with the user and they stop having a human-centered approach, because like the facile interpretation of design thinking is that empathy is a step and not a constant thread.
That's
So like that's
interesting.
just one experience that I've seen.
Yeah, I haven't researched that much into the D School, but I think empathy needs to be part of every single process or throughout the entire design process in general. Just because like you need to always think about the user and think about what kind of problems they're currently facing, because you might not feel the same, or you might not have the same perspective that you're designing for. So like you always have to keep that in mind. I think it's more it's more like a timeline thing maybe, and because it is a project they're doing within the school or within research, and they have a certain amount of time and that they have to deliver that certain thing at the end. So that might be the thing. That's a good question to ask one of the people who run the D School as well.
Yeah, well, it's like this methodology has been exported out, so people will do trainings at the D School on how to innovate and do design. So they're kind of taking this idea. And it's interesting, like, I don't think they're intending it to be that way, but like, if you've codified something and you don't have a coach walking you through, you can end up in some ways unintentionally doing more harm than good.
Yeah, it's a good thing to bring up. Oh,
All right.
1 minute left. But
I think I hand the
all
mic
right.
over to Astrid.
All right, it's great talking with
Good
you.
to talk to you, too. I'll grab mine.
Thank you. Mara and I do this a lot, handing microphones off to each other.
Oh yeah,
We have some
becoming a
practice.
skill.
My name is Astrid Scholz. I'm a recovering nonprofit executive turned tech entrepreneur. And I turn to technology to accelerate the pace of change in terms of changing the world for the better and achieving sustainability goals, dealing with climate change, all those good things. But I'm curious, based on the last conversation, you're a recent college grad. What made you create Spectra? Like, why? What's the why? Why take on a volunteer
Why put
position?
myself through that?
What kind of masochist are you?
I think it's just, so I went to community college at first, and I noticed that there wasn't a lot of women in the computer science classes I was in. And also, when I went to hackathons, I was always not heard as much when I was in those teams building out projects. And I really wanted to create a space that you could like meet other women as well, because at the time there wasn't an event in the Bay Area for women to like really come together who were my age too. So that's where it stemmed from. It was the frustration that I wasn't really meeting as many women in tech as I wanted to. And I wanted to meet more and also build out a system, because a lot of people also struggled with the same thing. And so I put it on Facebook and was like, hey, does anybody else want to create this event with me? And then it turns out a whole bunch of people wanted to. So it just kind of snowballed. And the first one happened. And then I was like, oh my goodness, there was huge impact for that. And people really, it was like their first hackathon ever, and they were saying, oh my goodness, this is why now I want to continue hackathons. So the next year happened, and the next year, and it just kept going. So like, I think it's just seeing how much passion people have toward hackathons and building out projects and talking about technology, and not feeling judged toward creating something or being not heard within a whole group of guys, for example. So just having equal opportunity.
What a concept, equal opportunity that we have to remind ourselves of in 2019. One thing I'm struck by, I think I have a few decades on you, it's like you're reinventing a solution. Like, we keep having to reinvent this solution of inclusion and creating safe spaces where everybody is heard, where everybody has the right to imagine and create a different future.
Right.
It's kind of insane, right? It's the sort of the definition of insanity that we keep having to relearn this and redo it. So I would love to figure out a way to make this easier for you.
Right, it's sustainable. So continue over
well,
and
it's
over
not
again.
sustainable that we have to keep redoing.
Right. No, I mean, what I mean, yeah. that's true too.
So I'm wondering if I tell you that I'm a 20-year veteran of the nonprofit industry and I've survived to live the tale. How can I help you?
Oh.
Because you're building a nonprofit essentially. I have opinions. How can I help you?
Wow. Okay, I haven't had somebody ask me this before. But I think having people talk during the events or creating more events. So we only put one on for 12 hours annually. So that's not a lot of time at all, but it's like the constraint we have currently that we always have to go by according to like the company that we rent out the space from. So just being able to put on more events throughout the year, for example, having people also from different diverse backgrounds. For example, in the Bay Area, we do get a lot of people who are interns in tech companies, but that's not the people we really want to focus on because they already almost have that kind of like pathway they're building already. But what about the people who are in, for example, community colleges that don't have that support system in universities that they can go to, for example? There's not really any organizations when you go to community college versus the huge job fair, for example, in UC Berkeley that people go to, especially like, I think it's like divided now between internships for one job fair and full-time jobs in another job fair, and it's like pretty insane. So just having that resource to people who aren't already having the opportunity to know more about tech, for example, or people who are in areas that don't really know that tech is an option for them at all. Like, what can they do to get into that field?
Yeah, I want to get super tactical with you, and actually,
okay.
So one thing I'll do is I'll introduce you to a friend who is a high school teacher in Oakland. Here's a guy who's actually a co-founder of my company, who went back to teaching. He's a middle-aged white guy, and he figured the best thing he can do is teach at Oakland Tech. I think it's a technical high school that attracts very, kids from a whole raft of very diverse backgrounds. And so he essentially has your pipeline, or parts of your pipeline, and I'd love to figure out if there's an interesting dialogue to be had between the two of you. I'd also selfishly like to figure out how we can help you scale this sort of programming, right? Because what you're doing is needed everywhere. And this coincidentally is what my company does. We try to figure out system design for scaling solutions.
Yeah.
You have a really interesting solution for the problems around lack of diversity in tech. One of the things we have done, actually Mara and I are complicit in creating an organization called Zebras Unite, which is essentially a safe place for founders of all different stripes that are building companies that don't just run off after the unicorn myth in Silicon Valley, and what we find is that people with different backgrounds solve different kinds of problems. You know, like I created a tech platform to help accelerate sustainability solutions. So now we have created essentially a community for ourselves that I'd love to invite you to join, for one. But also figure out how we can maybe get more exposure for the kind of programming you do, to get the word out, help you access resources for growing your program, because it's so important what you do.
Thank you. Yeah, I would love to meet the person from Oakland as well. That's something I wanted to do in the future. I wanted to teach. Currently, I tutor a lot of kids, and I always tell them, have you ever considered being in CS or like going down the STEM field? But all of them are like, no, I hate math, so I don't like doing it. But I'm like, math isn't the whole part of it, and so it's like opening up that empathy and trying to like warm them up to the subject of getting into STEM. Do you mind talking about then what made you start in the nonprofit sector? You did it for 20 years, so you must enjoy it a lot too.
I did for a while. I'm an ecological economist by training, and so I thought, where do I put that training to good use to essentially help save the world, right? It's not a small ambition, little 18-year-old me had. And so I studied economics as a lever, right? Thinking that is, money makes the world go round. I want to understand that. I want to help make interventions in the systems that help drive capital to the problems that we need solving, that we need to solve urgently. And so I found myself I graduated from UC Berkeley and went into just a couple of exploratory interviews and found myself working for a really interesting nonprofit organization headquartered right here in Portland that developed as part of its mechanism for doing sustainable development up and down the west coast of North America into innovative new business models. So there was, and it sort of appealed to me that notion that we can turn business into a force for good, and I just happened to be doing it under the umbrella of a nonprofit organization.
Wow, what made you wake up every day, or multiple days or so, knowing that you wanted to keep doing this nonprofit?
Well, eventually I ran out. Eventually I ran out of that passion because, like any industry, the nonprofit industry has its pathologies. And I got really, really impatient with sort of the waste that happens around, essentially reinventing the wheel continually, right? Whether those are conservation solutions or climate change solutions or poverty solutions, the nonprofits the world over basically keep reinventing the wheel, and the incentives, speaking as an economist, the incentives are misaligned around how we do the business of social change. And so 5 years ago, that impatience drove me to quit my job as president of a nonprofit organization and take a startup out that we had been incubating to basically try to now harness technology for good, in my case, to accelerate the pace and scaling of viable solutions like yours.
Wow.
So impatience, rage, a combination of impatience and rage.
So how do we stop this wheel though? Like, what are your thoughts about it, and how do you think we could keep it from perpetuating over and over again? I guess I'm less concerned about the nonprofit industry. I think it is well on a path to disruption. If you're reading the news just this week, we had a major scandal hit one of the big humanitarian organizations that are headquartered here in town. It's really, they're fragile business models that are sort of propped up by the larger societal patterns. What concerns me more is, like, how do we get people working on solutions? I was really struck by what we were talking about earlier, right? Like, how do we get all the people that are drawing on their own life experiences, like the folks that are coming to Spectra, right? How do we enable them to take that entrepreneurial idea and scale it? Because I fundamentally believe that there are solutions out there, but our existing institutions, whether they be large nonprofit organizations or tech companies, are not really equipped to let all those ideas flourish. So I'm really keenly interested in mechanisms and new communities for how those of us who are not, 23-year-old white males in Stanford, propagate our ideas for a better world. Well, all right, thanks.
Simple.
Yeah, totally. So can you talk about then what kind of, do you have examples or what kind of challenges that women are facing that you're incubating currently, or helping out?
Yeah, we should talk more about that too, because of course you're potentially encouraging women and non-binary folks to go into tech, where they're prone to run into the systemic barriers to access to capital and leadership roles, all those things, right? And we talked about this before we went on stage. Women only get 2%, less than 2% of venture capital. It's worse if you are a pigmented woman, if you're a woman of color. And they only get 5% of bank loans. It's ridiculous. It's 2019. We're 50% of the population, but there's this vast chasm when it comes to access to capital. And so some of the things we're working now on, what's required now, is figuring out how we create access to capital for women, for non-binary folks, for people of color, for immigrants, for refugees, for veterans, for millennials who are crushed by student debt, right? There's this massive need around capital innovation so that those folks that are coming out of programs like yours, have a place to find the resources to now take that idea forward. Mm-hmm. And then we also need to solve for all the other, systemic barriers, like we were talking earlier. If you don't look like what a venture capitalist sees in the mirror in the morning, you are just much less likely to get funded. And so the solution is we need different stripes of venture capitalists, right? And different stripes of capital to nurture those entrepreneurs.
How are you finding these people who are venture capitalists that are more in diverse colors, for example?
That's a really good question. We're about to launch a survey that we're going to be trumpeting out into the world, in part to find both founders and investors that think differently and that see the opportunity that's inherent in diversity. And so at the moment, there are examples like Backstage Capital and IndieVC, and so they're few and far between. And it's actually really challenging if you're an entrepreneur. I can tell you that they don't live on Sand Hill Road. But then where do they live, right? So where do you go and find them? And that's a really interesting challenge. Part of what we're trying to solve for with Zebras Unite is to create a community so that these folks can, and that includes an online community, so they can find each other more readily. But that is one of the big challenges, to create sort of more draw and sort of more magnetic attraction to the idea that there is power in diversity. Plant that flag, we call it Zebras Unite, you could call it something else, and then see who comes to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. I think we're out of time, but
the man is back.
We're gonna have.
Thank you. That was great. I have a microphone. You're the bookend to this panel.
No comment.
You get to start, you get to end. I was curious about something. I really want to thank you for bringing Ursula Le Guin into the conversation, like right at the get-go, science fiction writer. And I was curious, given your background, do women write different science fiction, and what makes it different?
Oh. I don't know if I'm as well read as I should be, just generally. Commenting on Ursula Le Guin, she was a pioneer. She was a science fiction pioneer and a feminist science fiction pioneer. One can see women. Science fiction has had a bias towards white male authors and readers, authors for sure, but that has been changing over time and has been changing rapidly through the past 20, 30 years. We see a lot more voices, actually. I can show a few books I've bought, Pals, and some others that I've brought along the way, because we see a lot of new voices and a lot of interest in how other societies and more diverse voices represent their own future. You can see that in Chinese science fiction. You can see that in the whole trend and interest in Afrofuturism, which is the African diaspora imagining either what might have beens or their own future. And there's the other thing about it is, and it's an interesting thread within all that, is that the general outlook on science fiction is one that focuses on maybe science and technology, while science fiction actually talks about, it does have science and technology in it, but it talks about how science and technology kind of transform societies. So different societies and different authors imagining different societies from their own identity, from their own history, from their own culture, would maybe imagine different futures and different results, or would want to see different results. So that is what I can comment about in that respect.
I was on a judging panel last year for sort of a global award. I think they were called the World Summit Awards. They were basically looking for technologically enabled solutions of different kinds to grapple with the big problems in the world. And they had a bunch of sort of criteria, and there was an interesting one, sort of arts and education got lumped together. There were some really interesting entries that basically looked to use technology to provide greater access and distribution to creators, for example, from the African continent, who, as you just said, tell very different stories about the future, right? But that's not what you and I see in sort of mainstream media and mainstream sort of pop culture. And I was really intrigued by very different ideas around how you reward and curate intellectual property, how you provide access, how publishing happens of sort of African anime, right? And it's just really interesting solutions. And we see this also in, and so that I'd love for you to sort of reflect back on that a little bit. Like, can technology help essentially amplify those diverse voices that have maybe something more hopeful to say, or have something different to say about the path our future could take?
The fact that a voice would come from specifically from Africa or from any global South nation doesn't necessarily mean it will be a hopeful voice.
No.
Actually might be very unhopeful, I don't know.
Maybe it's just a different dystopia.
Well, dystopias sell better. There's more conflict, there's more drama in dystopias, and they're easier to get to. They require maybe less imagination. I don't know. I mean, so 20 years ago when the internet wasn't at its, when the internet was GeoCities, or 25 years ago, there was like this thought that marginal voices would be heard more, and the periphery would become, when we would be enriched by a myriad of different voices. And 20 years have passed, and now I guess there's this great quote by Asimov. I don't remember the exact quote, but it's about anti-intellectualism in the US and the fact that not yours, but someone's lie is as good as my truth, or something like that. And I think we see that. We see that in current day's internet, and we also see that the model that the web has found, sadly, promotes the people who have capital to promote themselves, and therefore promotes the louder voices. So if you already were loud, you become louder. So in that respect, there is a larger periphery, and it can be accessed by people who want to access it. So it's easier for someone who wants to find diversity, who wants to read or see things that are not from mainstream. It's easier for that person to access that, but he needs to want that. If you would not want that, then what's readily made is mainstream, and it'll be popping up wherever you go on the web. So I guess I don't know if that's hopeful or not. I want to. I thought, I kind of looked a little bit on Sphera. Sorry. I thought. But going back to sustainability, it's such an ethereal concept. And if you're an ecological economist, is that right? So I kind of thought that the protests out here, which are, one of the protests, there were two, one of them was about the situation in Syria, regarding specifically the Turkish invasion and attack on the Kurds. And one can backtrack the situation in Syria to climate change. And I thought climate change, sustainability, very ethereal problems, huge problems that are talked about in the UN General Assembly and in Davos, but are really, they're hard to define for a person on the street. And these protests are the chain result, like one of the dominoes, a long way off of that. I was thinking about about what you do, and I thought we already have most of the technical solutions we need. We have mostly political problems and political gates and political challenges to overcome. I thought maybe you'd want to argue against that or comment on that?
No, I mean, you're exactly right. The solutions are already out there, right? We actually know what we need to do, and climate change is not a particularly challenging concept. People are becoming more intimately familiar with it. Our friends who are visiting from California can tell you how disconcerting it is to live in one of the richest counties in the United States and have your electricity go out. As a essentially climate change management measure, we can now expect to see more of that kind of stuff. So it just became very personal for 800,000 Californians, and it doesn't matter one iota that it's the 5th largest economy in the world. Now, of course, if you talk to folks in Kiribati and on some Pacific islands, they will tell you that they already know about climate change because their homes are floating away, right? So it's here, it's now, and you're right. I mean, we're beginning to see these more visceral responses, right? I have to be, like, I think anger and rage is an appropriate and rational response to the kind of inaction we've been seeing over, several decades. Where I land on it, I'm not a politician. I'm not putting much faith or much hope in the governments to figure this out, because they haven't for the last 100 years. Markets certainly haven't figured it out. As an economist, I'm not putting my faith in the markets. So I'm putting my hope, my faith, into just ordinary people all over the world who, no matter what their age, are and where they come from, are working on solutions, right? Because you and I and everybody else, we have to eat, we want food, we want shelter, right? We want to live well, not in 105-degree weather. And so people are actually working on these solutions. And so where I'm choosing to spend my next few decades is on figuring out how we can accelerate and scale the solutions that already exist.
So allow activists and social exchange activists and local groups, local nonprofits or global nonprofits with local chapters, allowing them the technology to generate change in their own locations?
It's not the technology so much, it's really about the money, right? Like, we know what we need to do,
yeah.
And we certainly have enough money. There's like, $250 trillion of capital sloshing around the world, and the UN estimates it's going to cost us 50 to not just solve climate change, but achieve all sustainable development goals.
There are more and more sovereign wealth funds.
Right, like if you added up the world's sovereign wealth funds and all the pension funds and all the things that we spend money on, like military forces and whatnot, we have the money. That's not the problem. We have the ingenuity. We have plenty of innovative people everywhere, like the folks who come to Kristina's hackathons, right? Like, we know we have the ingenuity and we know we have the capital. What's missing is the plumbing. So I very unglamorously describe myself as a solution plumber. We just need to build the pipes to point larger pools of capital to the people that are working on solutions everywhere.
I don't know if that's a hopeful or approach or not.
It's a pragmatic approach.
It's a pragmatic approach, maybe, yeah.
You can take the girl out of Germany, but you can't take the German out of the girl.
I think
we have 1 minute left.
We have 1 minute left.
Are there maybe audience questions? I don't know if that was contemplated in your program, but we have a minute. I can't see anyone. This is wild.
Do you think of yourself as an activist was the question. I assume for Astrid? But I do. But do you see yourself as an activist?
That's such a difficult question. How dare you? I don't. No. I just do what I can with the talents that I have. I think that may be an act of courage or stupidity. I'm not sure that it's.
Can I offer you an answer? Maybe you're an activist enabler.
There you go. An activist enabler. I'll take that. I mean, a catalyst. How about a catalyst?
A catalyst.
I'd rather be a catalyst than an activist.
All right.